to rise. Gradually, the pilot's mental capacity returned. Mere reflex and half-conscious reaction was beginning to be replaced by conscious, deliberate thought. For the first time since the explosion, the crew could now think about their situation, rather than just react to it. And as they did, the true gravity of the situation became apparent to them. A total loss of hydraulic power is an extremely rare event in a passenger airliner, but on the few occasions where it had happened, it didn't end well. The pilots of Flight 123 were well aware of this as they regained lucidity at lower altitudes. But at the same time, they were now better placed than ever to regain control of their aircraft. No longer suffering the dulling effects of hypoxia, they would finally be able to coordinate their problem-solving efforts and work together as a crew. In the passenger cabin, a flight attendant made an announcement to the passengers that they would soon be able to take their oxygen masks off. But this very saving grace, a lower altitude, now brought a new danger. Straight ahead of the plane loomed a towering mountain range. But it wasn't clear that a turn would be enough to clear the mountains. They would also need to climb back up to a higher altitude. With all of its engines at full power, the plane entered a steep climb. So steep that there was a risk that it would lose speed and stall. The captain told the first officer to reduce power somewhat so that they could keep the climb going without making it too steep. But in its severely damaged state, making precise changes to the flight path was like conducting brain surgery while wearing oven gloves. Controlling the pitch of the aircraft using engine power alone was an incredibly crude technique, but it was the only option the pilots had. But within just a few seconds, the aircraft had lost a huge amount of speed. If it lost any more, it could stall and fall from the sky. The first officer pushed the control column fully forwards, but this did nothing. He then pulled the engines almost back to idle, and finally, the plane began to pitch down. But it was too much. The gigantic aircraft, now flying at just 9,000 feet, entered a terrifying dive. The pilots pushed the four throttles fully forwards in a desperate attempt to power the plane out of its dive. They were now perilously close to the mountains, which began to block out the evening sun as the plane got lower and lower. In the midst of this fight for survival, Tokyo Control tried to contact the aircraft individually using the selective calling system, which rang ominously in the cockpit as the pilots battled for control. With full power to the engines, the plane now entered a rapid climb, the steepness of which the pilots had never experienced. The nose was fully 40 degrees above the horizon. Then, as the airspeed rapidly bed off, a new warning joined the fray. The stick shaker vibrated the pilot's controls violently, alerting them to an impending stall. Once again, the plane entered a horrifying plunge. pilots knew that this couldn't go on forever. They had become mere passengers on their own plane, reacting to its erratic movements as they happened. A witness on the ground would later describe the plane's movements as being like that of a staggering drunk. The pilots knew that to have any chance of saving their jet and its 521 passengers and crew, they would need to try something different.
I wish I could pay for live sports for just one day and not the whole month.
Sling lets you do that.
I wish I could finish one sentence.
The first officer suggested lowering the flaps. These would allow the plane to fly at lower speeds, reducing the risk of stalling. There was also a chance that they would provide some much needed stability to the plane's flight path. But without hydraulic power, the only way to lower the flaps was via the plane's backup electrical system. The pilots activated this system and began lowering the flaps. At a snail's pace, powered by the electrical system rather than the immensely more powerful hydraulic system, the plane's flaps began to extend. The first officer continued his Herculean efforts to bring the giant aircraft under control, and this time, it seemed to be working. By carefully timing his movements of the thrust levers, he had managed to arrest the plane's roller coaster motion. For the first time since the beginning of the emergency, the plane was now flying roughly level. The crew were now cooperating fully, their minds no longer dulled by hypoxia. This was their chance. They had to make it back to the airport now. The pilots contacted Tokyo Approach Control, but they were so disoriented from the plane's violent movements that they had completely lost track of where they were. How far were they from Tokyo now? Where would they have to point the plane to get back there? The flight engineer asked the controller. They were 55 miles northwest of Haneda, not that far for a 747. They could cover that distance in a matter of minutes. If they could turn their plane around and head towards Tokyo, there was a chance that they would be able to make it back in. And given their newfound stability, this was beginning to look possible. The first officer pushed the throttles forwards to counteract the drag that the flaps were now creating. But the flaps, which initially helped the pilot stabilize the plane, now slowly began to turn against them. Rather than stopping at a certain point, the flaps continued to extend. And as they did, the flaps on the left wing began to extend further than those on the right wing. This created more lift on the left-hand side of the plane, pulling that wing skywards and putting the aircraft into a gradual right-hand turn. Degree by degree, the pilot's hard-won control was beginning to slip away from them. As the plane banked to one side, the captain called for the flaps to be lowered further, to 10 degrees. He didn't realize it, but by this time, the flaps were already at 15 degrees, and were continuing to drop even further. Second by second, the imbalance between the flaps on the left and right wing only became greater. The first officer pushed the thrust levers forwards, but for some reason, he pushed the ones on the left side to a higher power than the setting for those on the right-hand side. None of the crew noticed this, and the plane began tipping over. The plane was now on its side and slipping rapidly towards the mountains below. From this low altitude, there was little space to recover. The aircraft began diving at over 18,000 feet per minute, 10 times the normal rate of descent. Instinctively, the pilots pulled fully back on the controls with all of their might. But it was too late. The right wingtip and its outermost engine hit a mountain ridge and were ripped off. The plane spun onto its back and careened into the mountainside at hundreds of kilometers per hour, igniting into an enormous fireball. Air traffic controllers watched on helplessly as the plane disappeared from their radar screens. They tried to contact the pilots, but got no response. Just 1 minute later, their worst fears were confirmed when a Japanese military aircraft reported seeing a huge burst of flames in the Nagano Mountains. The US Air Force had a plane flying nearby and offered to help to search for survivors, even though it looked like there would be none. But Japanese authorities rejected this offer, preferring to send their own country's rescue forces to the scene of the crash. However, because they didn't believe anybody had survived the crash, the Japanese didn't dispatch their rescue teams to the crash site until dawn the next morning. A full 12 hours had passed by the time they arrived, and doctors who arrived on site said that passengers whose lives could have been saved had they been discovered sooner had succumbed to their injuries during this time. In all, of the 524 passengers and crew, only 4 people survived. All of them were seated in the back of the aircraft. This figure would likely have been higher were it not for the disgracefully late response of the Japanese authorities. As a result of this crash, Boeing redesigned the tail of the 747 so that rapid would likely have been higher were it not for the disgracefully late response of the Japanese authorities. As a result of this crash, Boeing redesigned the tail of the 747 so that rapid pressure spikes in the tailplane would no longer cause the kind of structural failure which occurred on Flight 123. They also redesigned the plane's hydraulic systems, installing a fuse so that the loss of the aircraft's tail would not result in the total depletion of all 4 hydraulic systems. Japan Airlines also modified their maintenance procedures, putting in place stricter supervision of important repair work and making regular inspections more thorough. The airline's public image suffered a tremendous blow as a result of the accident, with bookings dropping by more than a third across the country in the weeks following the crash. Flight 123 remains to this day the world's worst single aircraft crash. If there's anything good to come from it, apart from the safety improvements made to the 747, it's that nowadays, rescue efforts are carried out as soon as possible after an accident, regardless of its apparent survivability. Thanks for watching this episode. If you'd like to see more episodes like this, you can watch this playlist up here. And if you'd like to